Very nice. Um, Tonight we have a speaker that some of you, I think, will probably remember because we had Jack. Was it last year, Jack, or maybe last year? It was last year, yes. So you can see how much of a hit Jack was that we invited him back so very quickly. That doesn't often happen. So we've got high expectations for tonight. I don't know whether we have anyone here in the audience who hasn't attended one of these webinars before. So just to explain very quickly how things work. Um, Shortly, I will introduce Jack, then I'll shut up and hand over to Jack for the webinar itself. Um, if you do have questions for Jack, what we'd like to encourage you to do is keep them and put them in the chat. Um, I was going to say for the in the Q&A, but I can't see a Q. Oh yes, it is there. I hope you can see the thing that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I actually can't see it without clicking a button that says more on mine, but hopefully it's apparent to you as an audience. If you would put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, that works better. That would be great. And then at the conclusion of Jack's talk, Tate will put the questions into a sensible order and make sure we don't get repetitions and that sort of thing. So I hope that was intelligible. Sorry about my confusion between chat and Q&A. It was because I just couldn't see the relevant button for the Q&A to start with. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. So Jack is a very experienced marine ecologist and field biologist. I feel very envious of him because he lives, or at least if my sources are correct, he lives in the west of Scotland. What a lovely place to live, and not many people manage to make that happen for themselves. So I'm very impressed that Jack has done so. His focus is marine mammals and seabirds. He's worked all over the world on research projects in connection with marine mammals and seabirds and other marine ecology. And he conducts a lot of wildlife and outdoor activity courses for learners of all ages in connection with the Field Studies Council centres. He's got a very in-depth knowledge of the sites and species that figure in his courses. His talk tonight is going to be called, let me get this right, Life on the Rocky Shores of the British Isles. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jack.
Thank you very much. The introductions get better each time. That's very kind. I'm just gonna share my screen. Apologies, I have to just swap things around because I've got two screens. I actually can't see the chat at the moment. Can someone, Helen, can you just tell me if you can see that or not? The PowerPoint's covered both screens. Hello?
No, we can't see that at the moment.
Oh, okay. It's exactly the same thing I did before. Oh, I know why. Hang on 1 second.
That looks better.
There you go.
Yeah, sorted.
Okay. It was a whale. Hopefully you can now see the right screen. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to come along again. As Helen said, I'm a marine biologist. Last year, I gave a talk on marine mammals and seabirds. It was really enjoyable. So thank you for inviting me along. I was told I had to do something different this time. So my day job is a marine mammal biologist for the Scottish Government, but for 6 years I worked at the Field Studies Council and I taught a lot of marine ecology courses. And one of the most common things that we taught at the field station I worked at was rocky shore ecology. So when I was invited back, I thought something to do with life or ecology on the rocky shores of the British Isles would be appropriate. first and foremost because it's really accessible for people to get down to. So hopefully you'll enjoy the talk, and maybe it'll inspire you to go and have a little forage on the rocky shore. Okay, it might have frozen. I've just clicked next, but I can see the next slide hasn't come up. Give me one sec. There we go. There we go. And maybe there's a bit of a delay on my end. We're very fortunate in the UK in terms of studying rocky shores because we have such a massive coastline. So I'll say the term littoral zone quite a bit probably throughout this talk. And the littoral zone is just the kind of area of water that interacts with the coastline. So that kind of land-sea interface. And as you can see in the UK, we have a huge coastline. Nearly 20,000 miles if you include all the islands that we have. And there's a load of different habitats within that coastline. So you have kind of cliffs, you have salt marshes, sand dunes, beaches. In Scotland, we're quite fortunate to have a lot of sea lochs, which are their own unique habitat, and these very, very deep, narrow channels. Sometimes hundreds of miles inland, but that are still fully marine. And obviously we have rocky shores, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of rocky shore ecosystems, they're incredibly diverse. There's so many species. If you were to go down and catalogue and spend a whole day collecting organisms and then going back and looking at the microscopic ones as well, you'd get hundreds, if not thousands, of species if you include the microbes. So they're very diverse ecosystems. They're extremely dynamic. I won't say any more on that because I'll cover why they're extremely dynamic later on in the talk. But yeah, they're ever-changing habitats. Most of the major groups of organisms that exist on Earth you can find on the rocky shore. So when I say major groups, I mean phyla, which is a kind of taxonomic term. It's like the highest grouping. So I'm sure you've heard of like mollusks or arthropods, kind of on that level of taxonomy. And so most groups of animals you can find on the rocky shore. I've just had a warning on my laptop that it's going to shut down and update in 10 minutes. I really hope that's not the case. I'm gonna crack on. If it, I think it's an auto shutdown thing. I might crack on, maybe have a pause in 5 minutes and just see if I can cancel it. Apologies, just had a pop up.
These things always happen when you're least wanting them to.
I know. Maybe I'll just check it now if that's okay. I don't know if I can. If I can change it anyway. Apologies, it's a work laptop and sometimes it just says, right, that's it, we're updating. I'm really sorry, guys. I don't want this to happen in. Okay, I've done my best to pause it, but because it is a government laptop, it does tend to shut down when it wants to shut down. There might be a 5-10 minute delay while it updates. We'll see how we go.
Well, I'm sure we'll wait patiently for you, Jack.
Thank you. I'll do it as quick as I can, and I'll sign back in. That's really, it doesn't give you any warning either.
No. Well, fingers crossed it doesn't happen. But if it does, we'll wait. It shouldn't take too long, should it? Usually.
Thank you. So the worst timing. I mean, it could have done it at any time of any day. But the rocky shore predominantly consists of species that are exclusively marine. So most species that you find there will be marine species, and they don't exist in terrestrial or freshwater environments. And the best thing about the rocky shore is it's very accessible for us enthusiastic ecologists to go out and study. So why do things live on the rocky shore? Well, there's two main advantages living on the rocky shore as opposed to living deeper under the sea, because all of these creatures are marine. So why would they bother living on the rocky shore when they can just live in the sea? Well, there's two things. One of them is light. And one of them is nutrients. So obviously you're not covered by hundreds of meters of water. So you've got a lot of available light. And because of seaweed decomposing on the beach and because of nutrient runoff on land, there's quite a lot of nutrient influx compared to somewhere like the open ocean. And because you have light and nutrients, that means you have everything you need for photosynthesis, which means you'll get some primary productivity. And the primary producers we have on the rocky shore will be different types of algae. So we have macroalgae, which is your seaweeds that we all know. So this is a photo of a couple of different species on the rocky shore. Seaweeds are split into 3 types. So you have your green algae, your brown algae, and your red algae. They're the kind of 3 main groupings of seaweed. We also have a microalgal film. So this is like a thin, sometimes microscopic coating that covers everything. It'll cover the seaweed itself, it'll cover rocks, and that's composed of microalgae, but they'll still be primary producing. And this is a photo taken from the rocky shore of a limpet grazing trail. So these marks are where the limpet kind of moves over the rock and uses its radula, which is a kind of I guess equivalent of like a tongue. It's like an appendage which has a scraping mechanism. So you can see that's evidence of the microalgal film on a rock because a limpet has come along and grazed it off. We also have phytoplankton. So we have these, they're floating planktonic organisms. They're microscopic, but essentially they're primary producers as well. So this is a photo of some plankton. So if you have some primary productivity, you're also going to have some primary consumers, also known as herbivores. So we have things like limpets, we have a ton of different snails and mollusks. We also have barnacles that will feed on microalgae, or phytoplankton, and mussels which filter feed, and sponges. So you have a load of different organisms that will eat the algae. And then obviously the next level at the food chain, you have your secondary consumers. So these are carnivores, and these are carnivores that will be eating the herbivores. And we have loads of different varieties of anemones. We have some predatory snails like the dog whelk. So this is a predatory mollusk. We have crabs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with going down to the beach. We have starfish. Once you get above secondary consumers, there might be other levels of consumers, but essentially you'll eventually get to the tertiary consumers, otherwise known as apex predators. So we have grey seals, we have herring gulls, or a variety of seabird species, and we have loads of different fish like that blenny. However, there is one big disadvantage to living on the rocky shore. Does anybody know what that is? Does anybody know what the worst thing about living on a rocky shore is for species? I actually can't see the chat without closing the PowerPoint, so I'll give everyone a couple of seconds to type something in the chat and I'll be able to read it afterwards. You'll know if you got it correct. So the worst thing about living on the rocky shore from an ecological point of view is the tide. The tide is what makes the tide coming in and the tide coming out is what makes the rocky shore an extremely challenging place to live. Most people go down to the shore and they walk along the beach and they don't think of it as an extreme habitat. You know, we think of that as being the polar environments or the desert or the deep sea. But the rocky shore is an extreme environment because of how changeable it is, and that makes it incredibly difficult for the organisms to survive there. So Millport is a town on an island where I teach courses off the west coast of Scotland. This is Crocodile Rock. It's a little tourist attraction. Some people have painted a rock to look like a crocodile. This is Crocodile Rock at high tide, and this is Crocodile Rock at low tide. And I'm sure everyone has a nearby beach or a beach they're familiar with, and they can imagine it at high tide and low tide. And it is a completely different habitat at those 2 times of day. I have to talk a little bit about tides for you to understand what the habitat is like on a rocky shore. So apologies, it's not a lecture on tides, but there will be a couple of slides to just explain. Some people will know all of this. Apologies if you're very familiar with tides and how they work. Some people might just know that the water goes in and out, and that's about it. So the definition is a little bit wordy. Periodic means it would happen regularly. Vertical means that water's coming in to the same height and going out to the same height. Some beaches, it will, in terms of horizontally, it could go in hundreds of meters, and then further down the shore, it might only come in a couple of meters. And that's just based on the gradient, but the height of the water will be the same. So that's where the vertical comes from. And it's caused by the forces of both the sun and the moon. A lot of people know it's the moon. Not everybody knows it's the sun that comes into play as well. So over a 24-hour period, you've got your tide height on the left, and then you've got time of day going on the bottom axis. And you can see we have high tides and we have low tides, and they're marked there. If So every day we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides. So the term for that is called semi-diurnal. So it means twice a day. Some parts of the world, they get diurnal tides where they only have 1 high tide and 1 low tide. And some parts of the world, they have mixed tides where it's not as clear cut as once or twice. And then some parts of the world don't have any tide. And it all depends on the water basin and how much the water can move. So briefly, this is what causes it. So we've got the moon here. The place on planet Earth that's in line with the moon, so either opposite or towards, the gravitational forces will cause the water to kind of to bulge out. So it pushes out towards the moon, but because of the way the water works, it also kind of bulges out on the opposite side of the planet. So we'd be here, if we were that person on planet Earth, we'd be here at high tide on the graph. In 6 hours' time, when we've rotated 90 degrees, we're kind of perpendicular to the moon. So we'd be experiencing a low tide. In another 12 hours, we'd be on the far side of the Earth and we'd be experiencing high tides again. And then again, in another 6 hours, it would be low tide. So that's what happens in a day. The way the sun works, sometimes the moon is in line with the sun. And when that's the case, the gravitational forces work together and they increase the size of the tide we have. So instead of having this normal kind of tide without the sun, the kind of light blue is what happens when you add the sun into the equation. And we call these spring tides. And spring tides, you have really high tides, so the water comes up the beach quite a long way, and you have really low tides, so the water will go out really far. Sometimes the moon is perpendicular to the sun. And in this scenario, the kind of gravitational forces almost counteract each other. So the gravitational force of the sun almost kind of mitigates a little bit, kind of counteracts the force of the moon. So when this is the case, we only have kind of a small bulge because some of the water is being pulled towards the moon and some of it's being pulled towards the sun. We call these neap tides. So the high tides you get won't come in very far and the low tides you get won't go out very far. So if we were to show these springs and neaps over the course of a month, that's a week, and then you can add in the days, and you can see that we have some periods where we have spring tides, and then some periods where we have neap tides, and that happens twice a month. Oh.
So I'm guessing that what has just happened there is that Jack's computer has shut down and is going to update. So we hope he'll be back with us very, very soon. But in the meantime, perhaps it's a good moment to go and get yourself a cup of tea or another drink or nip to the loo or something, and hopefully we'll be back on air in about 5 minutes or so. And see you then, and I hope we'll see Jack then.
Hello. I'm so sorry about that. Can you hear and see me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear and see you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I have no control over when it updates, and I think the government decided to do it at night because no one's working at this time. Can you see the screen if I've put it back up?
Not
Not
yet.
yet, but maybe soon.
Okay, I'll 1 second. Right, there we go. Okay.
That's looking
We're
good.
back.
Yep, great.
Again, I'm so sorry, guys. No notification, just you've got 10 minutes till it turns off.
Not your fault, Jack.
So I think this is where I left it. So as you can see, over a month, we've got our spring tides and we've got our neap tides. And just so you can see what the tides are doing today, this is where I live on the west coast of Scotland. And you can see that high tide was 3.5 meters. And we have a tidal range where I live of about 3.5 to 4 meters, which is about average for the UK. So you can see we're kind of on definitely not neeps at the moment. But if I put this into context of a week, you can see that going forward, we seem to be on kind of springs at the moment, and then we seem to be moving towards neap. And if I put it into a month, you can see the full spring neap cycle for specifically the West Coast of Scotland. For each part of the UK, you'll be able to find this data for where you are. In terms of tidal amplitudes, you can see pink and blue is quite a small tidal range, and anything into the yellows and red is a huge tidal range. So you can see there are a couple of places in the UK, places like the Solway Firth and the coast of kind of Liverpool and up to North Wales has quite a big tidal range, and the Bristol Channel has the biggest one. So the Bristol Channel in the UK, it has a tidal range of about 13 meters. So that's vertical height. And that's pretty big. I think the only place that has on Earth that has higher tides than that is the Bay of Fundy in kind of northeast US and Canada. So hopefully wherever you are, you should be able to see roughly how you stand in terms of tidal range across the UK. And it's all to do with where the water gets caught. So you'll see the inlets and bays on the west coasts, and you can see down here in the north of France as well. Anywhere where it's got somewhere to trap the water as it comes in from the Atlantic will have bigger tidal ranges. So I talked about the littoral zone, that interface of the land and sea. Often you hear people say, oh, they are the lower shore or the upper shore, or they live on the middle of the shore. And you can actually estimate these using your tidal data that I just looked at. So they're kind of the average of all the high water spring tides and the average of all the high water neap tides and everything you can plot on a kind of vertical cross section of your coast. So you can see this is kind of the difference in neap tides, and this is the difference in spring tides. So what that looks like when you go onto the shore, you can split your shore up into different sections. A lot of people think this is done arbitrarily. If you go on a rocky shore field course, we might say, oh, we'll look for those on the middle shore, but it's actually using tide data. So anything above the highest tide, we call the splash zone. So this area is never immersed fully. It's maybe only splashed by waves at a really high tide or in a storm or something. You've then got the upper shore, which is the difference between your highest spring tide and your lowest, so your highest spring tide and your highest neap tide. You've then got the middle shore, which is the difference between your high neap tide and low neap tide. And then you've got the lower shore, which is from your kind of low neeps to low springs. So you don't have to remember all that, but just so that you can see there is some logic in how we split up the shore. Apologize, took a little bit longer with the break, but I'll now talk about the ecology of the rocky shore. So now you hopefully understand a little bit more about tides. We can talk about how that affects the habitat of the rocky shore. So there's a lot of challenges of living in the intertidal zone, and the intertidal zone is just that bit that we talked about between high tide and low tide. So that bit that sometimes is covered and sometimes not is covered. Anything higher than that is just the terrestrial environment, is just land, and anything lower than that is the ocean or the sea, sometimes called the subtidal or the sublittoral zone. So we're talking about that bit in the middle that kind of is covered and uncovered to a various extent each day. So the biggest one for marine organisms, and remember I said at the start, all of the animals and the plants that we'll find pretty much are marine organisms. So they have evolved to live in the water. they all have gills or some sort of gill-like organ to be able to breathe water. Some of them can breathe air, but pretty much all of them will have to be wet to do that. They'll have to have at least some moisture. So desiccation is a scientific word for drying out, like desiccated coconut or something. So the risk of desiccating while you're immersed, so immersion is in the water, immersed is out of the water. The risk of drying out basically is a real risk. That's probably the biggest one. There's a huge temperature variation. So as I'm sure you're aware, if you're in the sea, in the winter, the sea around the UK, maybe the coldest it would get is 8 or 9 degrees. And in the summer, maybe the hottest it would get is 15 degrees. So there's not even and that's just on the shallow sea. If you go deeper in the ocean, the variation will be much smaller, to the point where you go down into the deep sea and there is no temperature variation. It's the same temperature all the time. However, on the rocky shore, in the winter on a cold day, you could have -5, and in the summer on a hot day, you could have 30. So it's a huge temperature variation depending on the time of day and the time of year. There's big fluctuations in salinity. So if you're in a rock pool and you're trapped in a rock pool on a hot day, the water evaporates and you're suddenly left in a really salty, briny liquid, which is quite damaging to cell membranes. Conversely, if you're stuck in a rock pool and it's raining, the salinity is going to drop. You might even end up in something that's approaching fresh water if it rains quite a bit. So huge fluctuations in salinity. You have illumination changes. So even something like 3 or 4 meters of water above you can massively impact the wavelengths of light that would reach you. So at low tide, you're exposed to full sun. At high tide, you have anything from like 3 to 7, 8, 9, 10, depending on your tidal range, meters of water above you, and that will affect the light that the primary producers can get. We have wave action. So if you've been down to a rocky shore on a real rough, stormy day, and you feel the power of the waves, you know, they're enough to knock a human over, and in some storms, it's enough to wreck yachts and destroy houses. All of those organisms on the rocky shore have to endure that, and you could have that for several days in a row, weeks in a row over winter. So wave action is quite a big one. Tidal scour is basically currents dragging things away. So you've got the action of waves, but you've also got the action of currents trying to drag you away. There's loads of different types of predators, and the problem with the rocky shore is you have lots of different types of predators. So in the ocean, you're mainly at risk from kind of fish predators or predators that at least swim. In the terrestrial environment, your main predator might be birds. In the rocky shore, you have to deal with both, and it's not just both at different times of the year, you have to deal with both at different times of the day. So at high tide, your main predators will be fish, and you need some adaptations to be able to defend yourself or hide. And then at low tide, your main predators might be birds. So twice throughout the day, you have to almost be able to deal with 2 different suites of predators. Lack of oxygen is a big one because, as I say, if you breathe water and for some part of the day you are not covered by water, you won't be able to respire, you won't be able to get your oxygen. So you'll need adaptations to deal with that. And the amount of time that you can spend feeding. So if you, pretty much all of the animals do their foraging or feeding at high tide when it's covered by water, which means for anything from an hour to 6 hours, depending on how high up the shore you are, you won't be able to feed. You'll be tucked away, you might be hiding in a shell, you might be in a crevice, you might have had to close all of your kind of apertures to stop yourself drying out. So you can only feed for a certain time of the day. And for some organisms really high up the shore that might only be covered by water for an hour to 2 hours at a time, that's your feeding window. So unlike most animals that can feed, you know, either throughout the day or throughout the night, you have a really tiny feeding window. So this is what these look like. I won't spend too long on this because I don't want to overrun, but pretty much everything I talked about, these are how the arrows basically point to if they increase or decrease as you go up the shore. So things like abiotic factors, you've got desiccation risk increases as you go up the shore, the variation in temperature increases, the variation in salinity and oxygen, all of that increases. The area where wave action is the worst is actually in the middle of the shore. Because if you think of that line, where you get waves is where the land meets the sea. So as that line moves up and down, that's where that's the area that's experiencing waves. And the bit in the middle is where that line crosses the most. So middle of the shore is worst for wave action. Light obviously decreases, as we've said, as you go down. You've then got some biotic factors, so things to do with other organisms. Predators, as I said, it's kind of in the middle is worst because you have to deal with birds and fish. The higher up you go, the more likely you will get birds and not fish, and conversely, as you go down, fish, not birds. There you go, there's fish and birds. Competition is a big one. So competition is one of the main reasons why species even bother. So everything I've said makes it seem like the rocky shore is an awful place to live. So why do marine organisms bother to live there? And the answer is there's less competition. So under the sea, it's nice and easy, or not easy, it's still a harsh environment, but under the sea is easier to live because of all of the different reasons I've just said. So as an organism, if you can evolve some sort of adaptation to survive on the rocky shore, you're going to have way less competition. There's going to be more space, there's going to be more nutrients, there might be more food. So competition, that increases as you go further down the shore. So basically, as it gets easier and easier to live, competition will increase. And competition is important. It's one of the main reasons rocky shore organisms even bother to live where they do. Oh, what have we got in the middle? Larval dispersion. I'll save that until the end because I have got something on larval dispersion. So I'll save that one to talk about at the end. So as I've said, you need a whole different range of mechanisms to survive on the rocky shore. You might want to live in a shell to avoid desiccation. You'll need some way of attaching, either attaching or hiding. So many of the organisms on the rocky shore are sessile, which is a fancy scientific word for stuck or not moving. So when you think of most seaweeds, barnacles, lots of different encrusting organisms, sponges, they don't move and they're attached to the rock. So that's quite a good method. If you can't, then you might still be able to move, but you might still have a sucker, like things like snails and limpets. Or you'd have to hide in a crevice, like a crab or a fish. And I'll talk about quite a few different feeding mechanisms. You might want to filter feed, which is where you suck water into your body, extract any particles of food, be it kind of detritus or microalgae or small animals, and then pump kind of clean water out. So things like mussels and sponges are a really good example of filter feeders. You might want to use tentacles like this anemone on the right-hand side. So when this anemone is covered up by water, the hole in the top opens, tentacles come out, and it can use those to catch prey. So they're just some examples of survival for animals. In terms of seaweed, I think seaweed have some of the coolest adaptations for surviving on the rocky shore, even though most people don't think seaweed's that interesting. So right at the top of the shore, we have something like Pelvicia canaliculata, which is channel wrack. And when this dries out, so when it gets exposed to air, its fronds, so it's kind of leaves, if it was a terrestrial plant, they curl up into like a channel. So they fold over and they trap that water so it can't evaporate. So that's a really cool mechanism for surviving desiccation. Spiral wrack twists as it dries. So it twists over itself, again, providing layers on layers of seaweed to trap some of that moisture. Egg wrack has these bladders which help keep it suspended. So when it's covered by water, a lot of the other seaweed is either kind of neutrally buoyant or negatively buoyant, so it will just kind of wash around at the bottom. If you have air bladders, it means it holds the plant upright in the water. So as I said, the higher up you go, the less water above you, the more light you get. So something like egg wrack will have these bladders that mean it can outcompete other species. It can even cover up some of the other species because it's lifted when the water comes in. Something like spiral wrack, Fucus vesiculosus, has a really thick waxy cuticle, very similar to on land, something like a cactus or a succulent would have. And this thick waxy skin is again an adaptation to avoid drying out. And all of these will have holdfasts, which is what we call the sucker on the bottom of seaweed. So seaweed doesn't have roots in the same way terrestrial plants have roots. So roots in terrestrial plants, they're an organ by themselves, and they're used for the uptake of nutrients and water. Seaweed doesn't have that. All of the any oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, it all happens through its skin, basically through its cuticle. So seaweed doesn't have roots; it has a holdfast, and the only function of that is to clamp it to the rock. So no roots in seaweed, if that's a fact to take away from today. In terms of animals, again, loads more adaptations. We have some of the snails will hide in crevices. Some of them are even small enough to hide in empty barnacles. We have barnacles themselves. They have a trapdoor that can open. So 4 plates that lock together at low tide and completely seal everything in and seal a little pool of water in with the barnacle. And then at high tide, they open those plates and something akin to like a feather. It's their feeding appendage. It looks like a big feather and it can waft in the water. So if you ever have a mask and snorkel or goggles at the beach, go and have a look, swim underwater, go and have a look at the barnacles. And if you look really closely, all of them will be open and their little feathery appendage will be catching food like that from the water. We've already talked about the tentacles of anemones, so I won't go into that. I mentioned briefly dog whelks, or a predatory snail. These have this appendage that comes out, and it's essentially a biological drill. It can bore a hole into other organisms and then secrete a kind of enzyme that digests them, and then they can suck it all up through that appendage. So mussels, for example, are a really common predator, a really common prey for dog whelks. If you ever find mussel shells washed up on the shore, it's somewhere on them, if you can find a perfectly spherical hole that's kind of maybe 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, perfectly spherical, that's probably been predated by a dog whelk. And we have starfish. Starfish have a really horrible method of feeding. They do move and they'll go over to something like a mussel. They'll use their arms to prise that shell open, and then they can extrude their stomach through their mouth, poke it into the shell, dissolve everything that's in there, and then suck it all back in. So it's a pretty gross way of feeding. They basically vomit their own stomach out of their mouth, secrete a load of enzymes, and then just suck everything back in. It's pretty grim. Wouldn't be nice to be predated on by a starfish. So the seaweeds are really important. Without the seaweeds, you wouldn't get anything living there because they're a source of food. They provide a source of shelter, and many animals will actually live on them. They'll attach to them. As I talked about before, you have brown, red, and green seaweeds. And these are zonated on that shore. So this is the diagram I showed you of the shore before, with the splash zone upper, middle, and lower. You tend to get a lot of brown and green seaweeds at the top of the shore. They're hardier, they're better resistant to desiccation. As you go down the shore, the species will get bigger. So the ones that you'll find in the splash zone in the very high upper shore, they'll be really small, little shrubby things. As you go down, the species will get bigger. In the middle shore is where a lot of your species live. That's the greatest diversity of seaweeds. And you'll get lots of browns, lots of greens, and it's the first time you'll see red seaweeds. So red seaweeds are red because of a pigment in them. And red light is one of the first wavelengths of light to be absorbed by water. So you often get kind of reds lower down the shore. When you get right down to the bottom, these are the seaweeds that don't spend a lot of time out of the water. So they won't really have many adaptations to avoid drying out. And this is where you'll get the bigger, heavier ones like kelp. And on the west coast of Scotland, well, all around the UK, but it's particularly good on the west coast of Scotland, we have huge kelp forests where kelp can grow to 5-6 meters high. And it's almost like an underwater forest where loads of fish, juvenile fish, can use them as almost like nursery grounds. So it's where they'll be safe from predators and they can hide. We also get this zonation in animals, though, and periwinkles are a really good example of that. So these are all different species of periwinkles. So they are different species, but they're all broadly similar organisms, and they will exist at different heights on the shore because of their adaptations. So we get the common periwinkle distributed throughout the shore, but then we only get this flat periwinkle in the middle shore, and you only really find it on brown algae because it's evolved to look a lot like one of the bladders. So if you might find these on bladderwrack, and when you actually find them, they are incredibly difficult to tell apart from just a bladder of the seaweed. We have the small periwinkle, which is so small that it's evolved to actually live in dead barnacles. So these little crevices, when a barnacle dies and the trapdoor disappears, but you're left with a hole, these small periwinkles can actually fit in there. And that's how they avoid kind of getting dragged away by the tide. And then we've got rough periwinkles. These, they're normally found on cracks and crevices, but these have an extremely strong foot. So that sucker muscle on the bottom is extremely strong, which is really good for surviving wave action. We also see it with top shells. So again, more snails. You'll get some that are abundant on the lower shore, some in the middle, and some on the upper. And again, it's all to do with the adaptations they have. I'm just going to go a little bit quickly because I know I'm at the time I was allocated, but I had to pause for 5-10 minutes. So I'll go a little bit quicker. You'll be familiar with limpets. You find them throughout the shore. They're really firmly attached to rocks. I mean, you can just about boot one off with a toe or the heel of your boot if you really wanted to for some reason, but they have an incredibly strong sucker. We have 3 species in the UK. They're also quite tasty if you fry them in garlic and butter. If you're in for some local seafood that you can forage at the beach. You can't talk about rocky shores without mentioning the different types of rocky shore. And in the UK, because we have a coastline all the way around, some countries might only have a west-facing coastline, for example. In the UK, we have coastlines that face every single direction of the compass. If your coastline is facing into the prevailing wind, and in the UK, the prevailing wind typically comes from the southwest. So over the course of a year, on average, most of our wind comes from the southwest. It comes from the Atlantic. So shores that are facing south or southwest in the UK, anywhere from south all the way through to kind of west, anywhere in that kind of quadrant of the compass, you're going to get exposed shores. And what we mean by that is they're exposed to more wave action. So you'll get bigger waves, you'll get waves more frequently, you'll get way more days of the year where you're going to have waves crashing on that shore. Conversely, anything that's kind of east to north facing, you'll get a sheltered shore. And these are typically protected from the prevailing wind. It's a much calmer environment. There's less waves. And so the habitats you'll find in these 2 different shores are very, very different. Exposed shores, the animals will not be very obvious. You'll really have to search. They'll be small. They'll be hiding in cracks and crevices. The seaweeds will be shorter and more stunted, and you'll get way less species of seaweed. So overall, they're kind of less diverse. The exposed shore, far more extreme, far more difficult to live. So you'll get less species, but you'll also get less individuals of each species. The sheltered shore, on the other hand, it's really unlikely you're going to get ripped away by the waves. So you end up with huge lengths of seaweed. And because there's loads of seaweed and there's not a lot of wave action, you get loads of animals. Sometimes on the sheltered shore, you don't even have to turn over boulders. You can just lift up bits of seaweed and you'll see crabs and fish under there. So I can't talk about rocky shores without mentioning those 2 different types, because your experience when you go down onto the rocky shore and the species that you might find will be completely different depending on which way that shore is facing. It does vary throughout the country as well. Typically, our rocky shore organisms, because they can disperse quite widely because of the sea, you do get similar species all the way around the UK. There's not a huge amount of difference. Right in the south and right in the north, you might get 1 or 2 different species that don't exist elsewhere. But for the most part, the species are the same. So if you go down to a shore and you think, oh, this looks different to where I go on holiday, in Wales or something, it's not really due to geographic location, the spread of organisms. All of those organisms could or would live there if it wasn't for that wind direction. So that kind of maybe explains the differences that you might see when you go down to the rocky shore. I won't dwell on this because I've kind of just talked about most of this. I didn't realize I'd wrote it all down. The last thing I'm going to talk about is recruitment, which is a very fancy word for how do the organisms get there, when they breed, what happens to them, how do they go from an egg or a juvenile into the adult population. So if the rocky shore is so difficult to survive and it's particularly hard for larvae to disperse, where do all the juveniles go? Where are all the babies? Why don't we see loads of kind of babies or eggs on the rocky shore? Where are they? And again, I can't see the chat, but if you could, maybe I'll give you a couple of seconds to hammer in on the chat. You've probably got it all right. So most of the juveniles and eggs are in the plankton. So I'll talk about plankton for just 2 slides because I think it's really important to understand how things breed on the rocky shore. So there's a really nice quote from Sir Alister Hardy, who's a really famous plankton scientist. There's a foundation in Plymouth named after him, and they're the leading institution that researches plankton in the UK. So he said, there is the life of plankton in almost endless variety. And what he means by that is something like this. So this is a composite image of loads of the different types of plankton that you might find in the ocean. Almost every phyla you can think of is represented here. There's crustaceans, there's mollusks, there's arthropods, there's mollusks, there's cnidarians, there's echinoderms, there's annelid worms, there's almost everything in there, and there's loads of algae. So there's also a lot of algae. So like these things here on the left, all of these are planktonic microalgae. So it's just amazing how many different things are in that drop of seawater. I always apologize on field courses. Next time you go in the sea and you're like shaking water out your ears or your nose, I'm afraid that probably some of these beasties would have been in there. And you can see here that for some of the common things that we might find on the beach, your barnacles, your starfish, your mollusks, your fish, crabs, they all have a planktonic life phase, and this is what they look like. So they undergo a complete metamorphosis. So something like a caterpillar changing into a butterfly. The planktonic version of each organism you find on the rocky shore will look nothing like they do on the beach. They undergo a complete body transformation, and often they're unrecognizable. Pretty much everything on the rocky shore, the algae and the algae and the animals will have multi-stage life cycles. So it's not just from one to another. Like it's not just from a caterpillar to a butterfly. It'll be from one larvae to maybe a bigger, different type of larvae to maybe a third larvae, and then maybe the adult form. So at least one of these stages will be planktonic. I think there's very few exceptions of stuff that you would find in a rock pool or the rocky shore that doesn't have a planktonic life phase. This is really good because when the tide comes in, you can release your eggs or larvae and they go off into the ocean. They grow and survive in the ocean, which you would think of, it's not a safe environment, but it's certainly safer than the rocky shore. Certainly safer than being an egg or a tiny larvae on that really extreme rocky shore. So this planktonic larvae dispersal means that not only do you increase the odds of your offspring surviving, but they can also travel hundreds of miles, and some of them might be planktonic for months, if not years. So they could travel to different parts of the UK, different countries. They could settle hundreds of miles away from where they were hatched, basically. And then when they settle, they use a variety of different cues to settle out. Crabs, there's studies that have shown they can somehow detect the noise of crashing waves, so they know when to start their transformation from something that looks like this into something that looks like this. Different organisms might use chemical cues. They might be able to sense nutrients. They might be able to physically see the shore. And each one will have different methods of doing it. Some of the algae will need to almost be washed onto a rock to begin the attachment process. Some of the animals might just find themselves in a rock pool and then start their transformation. So there's different cues depending on different organisms. So I'm going over my time. I'm on time if I didn't have a laptop malfunction. So just a little bit of a summary. The rocky shore is an extreme habitat. Again, not something that most people think of when they go for a walk on the beach, but it is an extreme habitat from an ecological perspective, and hopefully some of those variables that were constantly changing throughout the day, you'll remember. The organisms that survive there, they must have evolved some adaptations to deal with those ever-changing conditions. I remember their adaptations to avoid predation, to avoid desiccation, to avoid being swept away from the sea. Those are the three main big ones. So anything that you find there has evolved over millions of years to become perfectly suited to that environment. Most animal phyla or groups of animals can be found there if you look carefully. Some of them might be microscopic. Some of them you might only be able to find at the lowest tide of the year. But almost all those phyla that I talked about, your arthropods, your mollusks, your cnidarians, your echinoderms, your annelid worms, almost all of them can be found on the rocky shore. So if you're teaching a course on taxonomy or you want to find as many different types of animals as you can, the rocky shore is by far the best place to do it. Better than going in the woods, better than going in a stream or a lake, better than going in the mountains, in a field. You'll find more different types of animals on the rocky shore than you will anywhere else in the UK. And a good rocky shore on a nice spring tide, a nice spring low tide, I think is by far the best opportunity that ecologists have to experience the marine environment and marine creatures up close. Unless you're a diver or unless you snorkel, and even then it's difficult because most things are big enough to swim away, but low tide on a rocky shore on a sunny day you will find so many marine organisms that you would have never thought were there. And hopefully some of you have already done this. I know you guys do field excursions and potentially rocky shore is one of the things you've already done, but it's by far and away my favorite place to get actually hands-on and up close with marine species that you wouldn't normally find. So that's me. I'll stop sharing. Just let me stop sharing. Okay, and I'll move you back up here. Okay, can people see and hear me?
We
Yeah,
can, Jack.
we
We
can.
can. Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Sorry for overrunning by about 10 minutes. That would have been perfect without the laptop malfunction.
No worries at all. Tate, do we have questions?
I'm afraid we've drawn a complete blank on questions, so get your thinking caps on, folks. I've got one though.
And me
Um,
too.
Yes.
So you go first, Tate, and then I'll
you
ask mine.
you talked about the adaptations for organisms living on the rocky shore. Have you got a personal favorite or a particularly cool adaptation of something you just think, wow, that's amazing?
So my favorite animal to find on the rocky shore is probably due to its not rarity, but you might have heard, especially with things like Blue Planet and how many wildlife documentaries there are these days, of nudibranchs. They're these they're spelt nudibranches, but you'd say it nudibranch. They're called sea slugs. Their common name is a sea slug, and they're quite difficult to find. You'd only ever find them really low down on the shore at spring tide, but they are crazy different colors. There's oranges, pinks, reds. Some of them have like tentacles all over their back, or like they look like a feather, and they've got their little snail horns that come out. And they're maybe a little bit cliched as a marine biologist's favorite animal because they are extremely difficult to find. They're really camouflaged and they're stuck in crevices. But yeah, if you ever find a nudibranch on the rocky shore, you're doing really well. And I think they're my favorite just because of how beautiful they are. They don't really have a huge amount of adaptations to survive on the rocky shore, which is why they have to live so far down. They really can't handle being out of the sea for very long, but they are rocky shore organisms and you do find them. If people don't know what I mean, if you Google NUDI and then branch, nudibranch, you'll see what I mean. They're incredible organisms, and when you look at them, you don't think something like that would exist in the UK. You think you should be watching an Attenborough documentary of some coral reef or something because they're just crazy looking. But we do have them.
Question from Jeff. Is there seasonal variation to life on the shore?
Yes, most evidently with the seaweeds. So in the seaweed, for seaweeds on the rocky shore in the UK, in the summer, and again, the differences I'm about to talk about are more pronounced as you go up the shore. So these differences will be really evident on the top of the shore, but probably not so evident on the bottom of the shore because of how often they're covered by water. So at the top of the shore, the seaweeds, especially kind of late summer, July, August, September, they go almost brown, black, and crispy. They look like someone's just taken a blowtorch and burnt them all off. And that is kind of the consequence of being a seaweed on the upper shore in a hot UK summer. So they'll go super crispy. Some of them will die. Some of them might be able to rehydrate and kind of replenish themselves. In the winter, we have really bad storms and that rips off loads of seaweed. So we've all been to the beach and wanted to put a towel down and sunbathe, and you're just left with this huge barrier, a meter high of rotting seaweed that's piled up. So that will happen throughout the winter and early spring because of winter storms. So all of those seaweeds at some point were probably growing lower down the shore and they've been ripped off and plucked up on the shore. So in that kind of winter springtime, there'll be a lot more space, and that's where, just ready for the kind of warm weather, you'll get all the little budding seaweeds start to grow. So yeah, they're kind of two seasonal differences you might notice if you yourself went down to the rocky shore. You'd see crispy stuff at the top, and in the winter you'd see loads of dead stuff kicked up by the waves.
Question relating to seaweed. Are seagrasses exclusively marine and not littoral?
So seagrasses, yeah, they are. They're not sublittoral. So littorals, they're kind of that area that kind of is the water around a coastline. Seagrasses are sublittoral, which means they can't survive out of water, or at least not very well. So almost all the seagrass beds you'll find in the UK will be in at least a couple of meters of water. So they'll be subtidal or sublittoral. I don't know if there's other places on Earth, or there's obviously lots of different species of seagrass. Seagrass is just a catch-all term for grass that grows in the sea. There might be species that are better adapted and might be able to survive in some. The problem is they're very delicate. So they would never survive on a kind of exposed shoreline. Maybe in some parts of the world, there's nice sheltered habitats where the seagrasses can deal with being uncovered by the water by an hour or two a day. But at least in the UK, and at least the seagrass beds I'm familiar with, they are all like 2-3 meters below the kind of, the low tide mark. You won't see them uncovered.
One more. Are microplastics a big problem for rocky shore organisms?
Yes and no. It depends firstly on where you are. So microplastics, they are obviously ubiquitous in the ocean, but they're concentrated more in different areas. So for example, where I am in the Firth of Clyde on the west coast, it's nice and beautiful, but it's also enclosed by land on 3 sides, and you've got some of the biggest towns and cities in Scotland are located there. So you've got kind of Glasgow is right at the top of the estuary, and so any areas like that, you're going to be exposed to more microplastics than you would somewhere in like the open ocean. Microplastics are a problem depending on how they interact. Some small microscopic organisms might kind of choke if you can do that as a microorganism, but yeah, they might have blockages or they might ingest microplastics, and that might be a problem if you're really, really small. But microplastics are a problem when you go up the food chain, and this is a phenomenon called bioaccumulation. So if a tiny little bit of plankton eats 1 or 2 bits of microplastics, it might be absolutely fine. That plankton might get eaten by a really small fish, and that fish might eat 50 of those in a day. So that fish now contains all of those microplastics from 50 plankton. A bigger fish might eat another 50 little fish in a day. So as you go up the food chain, once you get to something like a seal or a dolphin or a seabird, they've eaten so many species that contain so many different species that all contain microplastics. You can end up with some not necessarily death, but certainly some sublethal effects, so impacts to your health. So it might be that the toxicity of all these microplastics, they might lower your reproductive success. They might slowly interact with other toxins or contaminants in your body to do something nasty. And they might make you more prone to disease or sickness. So macroplastics, like big bits of plastic, we've all seen seals or dolphins or whales entangled by bits of plastic. We've all seen photos of that albatross that was cut open and it's got a stomach full of plastic. So that's your macroplastics, your big bits of plastic. And the risks for those is ingestion. So either choking, or when your stomach's so full of plastic that you can't eat anymore, or entanglement, where it gets wrapped around you and then you drown or you die. So that's normal plastics, but microplastics is this almost kind of more subtle impact on health over time, and it's worse the higher up you get in the food chain. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, well, we are at time, so back to Helen.
Did you have a question, Helen?
I did. I was just going to ask whether you might be able to recommend a rocky shore not too far from us in Yorkshire, either on the Yorkshire coast or maybe the Lancashire coast. I don't know whether you have a particular favourite.
That's a really good question. So I've never lived in Yorkshire, but I've worked there for bits and bobs, and I've been to some conferences. And Newcastle University, the shore that they go to conduct all their rocky shore experiments is Robin Hood Bay.
Oh,
That's
yes.
in Yeah, so because I kind of studied in the southwest in Plymouth, I'm from the Midlands and I live on the west coast of Scotland. Yorkshire and Lancashire is kind of about the furthest away geographically. So I don't know that part of the world very well, but I've heard lots of scientists in their presentations talk about experiments or investigations at Robin Hood Bay. So I can only assume that must be a really good one for rocky shore organisms.
Okay, well, I'm going to be making tracks to Robin Hood's Bay and seeing what I can find there. Thank you so much, Jack. I said we would have high expectations, and they were more than met. Absolutely
Too kind.
fantastic talk yet again. I've learnt so much, and you've exposed my complete ignorance of things that really I ought to have known much more about. I had absolutely no idea, for example, really what plankton consisted of. I realised I've just sort of never really thought about it before and thought it was sort of all kind of plants, really, of one
Oh, it's
kind or
all the
another.
wee beasties. Every time you blow
Yeah.
your nose and every time you get water out of your ear, just imagine all those little crabs and shrimp wriggling around in there.
No, absolutely remarkable. I'm really hoping that one day I'm going to be invited on Pointless and that the question has come up that people have to name a herbivore, and everyone else is going to be saying like sheep and horse and things like that. And I'm going to be saying barnacle, and I'm sure I'm going to win if I do.
Would you like probably the most common fact about barnacles that's said? And I say it to all the school kids, and they find it really hilarious. But you won't forget it either. So the barnacle has the largest penis to body ratio of any animal in the animal kingdom,
Really?
because they have to sexually
Wow.
reproduce, but they're stuck to the rock, which means if that barnacle's kind of, it can't
Yeah.
move. So I think that 9-10 centimeters long they can be for a barnacle that's a centimeter. So
Gosh.
if there's a fact
Crikey.
about barnacles to go away with, it's the longest penis to body ratio of any animal on Earth.
Right.
The
Another
kids
reason to
love
go
that.
to Robin Hood's Bay and see whether you can actually find one.
Yeah.
Well, that was absolutely wonderful, Jack. I'm sure everyone else has loved the talk just as much as I did. I feel, absolutely full of new ideas, new information. You present it all so beautifully. And also, I mean, just the sort of scientific setup at the beginning was so lovely. I've never seen such a perspicuous account of the tides, for example. It's always seemed very complicated, and you made it seem very simple. So thank you very much, and I do hope you might come back yet again. It'll have to
I'll
be a
have to find
different talk,
I'll
another
have to
one.
find something else. I've got so many presentations from years teaching that I'm sure I could find something.
Well,
Yeah,
that would be wonderful. We'd be only too glad to have you, Jack. Thank you so much. And yeah, hope to see you again before too long.
thank you.
I've got a few quick things to say. One, which is weighing on my mind, is the summer program. If people have ideas about things we might incorporate, I'm already having a Rocky Shore idea, I must admit, even as I speak. But if people have suggestions for places we might go or would like to lead a walk, then please do get in touch with me or with Ian, because the summer program is now in the process of being put together. Coming up, we have a range of things. 25th of January, we've got a visit to St Aidan's led by Nigel Steele's birding trip. So that will be, I'm sure, really good. Sadly, I can't go myself, but St Aidan's is always wonderful. So I think that would be a really good one to turn up to. On, I think, the 28th of January, we've got Rob Knipe, who's giving a talk called Climate Change in Wharfdale Deep Time. That's an in-person talk at Christchurch. And then on the 11th of February, we've got our next webinar. That's going to be Nairi Fernley talking about, well, gosh, what's the title of it? Let me have a look. Butterflies and their associated plants is what it's called. So I hope to see you again there. In the meantime, have a good evening, and thanks once again, Jack, for coming to visit us. Thank you.